Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our last day of the conference. I'm very glad that you made it on this Saturday morning to here. I hope you all had a very good and joyful and hopefully inspiring day yesterday. The morning today is a bit different than it has been before, because I think it's good to have a bit dynamic format as well, not always the same procedure. So we will start this morning with a very relevant and important discussion for contemporary societies about nationalism first. Because when we were planning this conference, we saw that we got several proposals discussing this issue of right-wing movements, and we found it was a really great opportunity to bring these researchers together and create a more interactive format, integrating you as the audience as well, discussing those issues. So the title of the panel discussion is Nationalism First, discussing right-wing movements as global phenomenon. And we have speakers from different countries, from the US, from England, from Brazil and Poland, which I will introduce a bit more shortly and brief. Okay, now I don't want to waste too much time of our speakers. The format that we have thinking is like we gave a short time for every speaker and said, please limit it to 10 minutes, and I will be a bit rigid about that. I mean, it can be 11, 12 or something, but I will show you, because otherwise we won't have the time to discuss together. And this, I kindly ask the speakers to accept, and when I hold the paper, and because the idea is like to have 4 inputs of about 10 minutes in a row, so you have a good overview about what those experts from the US, from England, from Brazil and Poland are doing, and then go into a joint discussion here on the panel between the panelists, taking into consideration also questions which come from the audience.
So, vielen Dank für die Einladung, hier zu sprechen. Leider muss ich auf English sprechen, so I'll speak out in English. But thank you for the invitation to speak. So I'll talk today about political populism, self-destructive affects, and link this back to Brexit, a topic that dominates the UK in a stifling way, the UK political scene at the moment. So to give you a brief overview, which will be brief for the 10 minutes I have, I'll take you through some accounts of Brexit 2016 and its links with right-wing populism, because there were some important connections with both extremism, but then also how the mainstream in politics has shifted towards the right in the UK. So UKIP, particularly the United Kingdom Independence Party, began as an outside group in the 1990s and then reached its peak with Brexit, and has now dissolved, but its toxic legacy remains. Then I'll take you through very quickly the contemporary relevance, I think, of Fromm's concept of necrophilia, which actually fits very nicely this topic, and give some crucial qualifications, extensions of this work, and then address also Brexit's impact. So just as a reminder of Fromm's position on necrophilia, he defines it as the passionate attraction to all that is dead, decayed, putrid, sickly. It is the passion to transform that which is alive into something unalive, to destroy for the sake of destruction, the exclusive interest in all that is purely mechanical. It is the passion to tear apart living structures. This is a use by Gunari to describe the situation, the political situation in Greece after the bailout there. Her analysis focused on social necrophilia as a blunt, organised effort on the part of the domestic political system and foreign neoliberal elites, neoliberal centres, to implement economic policies that result in the physical, material, social and financial destruction of human beings. Now, that's a very broad account, and what I want to do is position this in terms of affect, from, and identity. And I can do that through some rather gruesome looking cartoons. So this is a nice, very nice entry into the topic. If you think it's necrophilia is a kind of a rather bizarre term to use if you're not a Frommian, then this is a very nice way to represent it. These macabre characters of the Tory party, the Conservatives leading Brexit. Okay. Even more stunning is the depiction here of the UK sitting alongside the equally macabre-looking Theresa May. And then, of course, we have the sheepdog here of Boris Johnson. But a really very nice illustration of this idea of necrophilia realised in a particular way through a cartoonist who has no Frommian interests or illusions in this. Okay, so I'm already about 6.5 minutes remaining. I'll go through my remaining 4 slides very quickly. So, yeah. So populist and extreme right parties and social movements are against the middle ground and elites. And in this, they mobilize discursively and emotionally the will of the people. This is always referred to as what they're representing. So the will of the people, as exercised through the EU referendum, cannot be denied, changed. If you do that, you're seen as basically a traitor in the UK at the moment. This is the discourse. Explanations of Brexit focus on ideological and structural drivers, but there is more to this. We need to examine the identity and the emotional features. So the predictions are not enough. We need to look at factors such as anger, betrayal, and also nostalgia. These complex mixtures of both the positive and the negative, but not only individual emotions, but group-based emotions and collective emotions, whether that means aggregate or genuinely collective. So collective emotions being the most obvious example being protests, the emotions that occur in those kinds of situations with the co-presence of others. So all those emotions have been implicated, and I think it's fair to say that Brexit was driven by a complex mixture of these different emotions, different types of emotions, that have these necrophilic characteristics. So the negative, with the ongoing situation with Brexit, we have this restricted solidarity. So some of my research shows that people say we're looking after ourselves, so we don't have solidarity for Europe, or Europeans, that's reduced. We have solidarity for our own people, we put our own people first. What you find is that's not overly positive. In fact, it's actually quite negative. It's restrictive, and it's another way, in fact, I think, of reworking prejudice. Okay, so it's focused on the past also, often nostalgic, with the effective empowerment of defensive, punitive, and destructive features. We had a rise in hate crime the day after the Brexit result in the UK. And that still continues, but some people feel empowered by the result to be racist in public, for example. So the affects are not life-affirming, they're not open, they're not celebratory, they're not inclusive. A lot of this involves anger and frustration with the delays in Brexit, and this rigid determination to deliver a result, despite its self-destructive on a national level form. So it's this continued adherence to Brexit that's problematic. And of course, drawing on Fromm too, we can also look for group identities and identification, including nationalism. Now, there are some critical qualifications on this as I draw towards a close. It's important to resist, though, pathologizing supporters of right-wing populism. So I'm meaning very general. If we consider Brexit to be an instance in which 52% of UK citizens voted to leave the EU, then it's on much broader terms than extremist groups, which are still quite small, but have dictated policy and changed the nature of the conversation in the UK. And indeed elsewhere, because populism is spreading. So whereas in the past we had the top issues concerning citizens, say 10 or 11 years ago, being things like care and old age, now the top issues are terrorism and immigration. So this is really taking control of things. I think it's also important, that we compare populists on both the right and the left, and this is kind of leading to a close, that there's a danger of necrophilic kind of characteristics emerging in the left resistance to right-wing extremists and the right wing. So we need to do this in different ways, in different politics. It's important to avoid talk of national characteristics, I think, too. So I think this is where I'm a little critical of Fromm, and I actually draw a little on Wittgenstein there. We need to be careful, too, of describing group affiliations and identities in terms of herd-like characteristics. We need to be very careful with that. Youthful openness and exuberance is also not necessarily the solution to the situation with Brexit, the ongoing commitment to it. We need to know why it is that people become more conservative with age. So this is one of the key predictors in the UK. Older people voted for Brexit. It wasn't just men, it was actually men and women both voting for Brexit. As they got older, people become more conservative. Yeah, and also just we need to be very careful that younger people without an experience of authoritarian regimes or fascist regimes, that collective memory, without that, they don't have that experience to draw upon to resist the appeal of some of these right-wing populist ideas, politicians and movements. Okay, so very last point in the 40 seconds I have remaining. Solidarity, hope and engagement, I think, are key to a sane societal response to right-wing populists and to the current divisions. So I'm thinking here particularly of the UK. Activism and resistance also from the middle and the left needs to avoid these necrophilic characteristics. Every day I see reports on the news in the UK about Brexit and how even a vote for Parliament is now being denied, the possibility of a meaningful vote on the deal. There's a real danger that I react to that in the way that others do, that this becomes depressing, the opposite of life-affirming. It sucks all energy and enthusiasm for any more positive political projects. It's also important, as we will discuss, I'm sure, in the group, that we challenge nativist ideas of national identity, so that's often crucially linked to populism, particularly on the right. So we need to understand the being and the becoming of ontological security. So not only the being of it, the identities we seek out to maintain a sense of certainty, of ontological certainty, we also need to look at the affects involved in challenging these identities, and so more complex process of becoming. So I think I've probably gone about a minute over. The last bit I'll say is the effective tone of our conversation-based responses to right-wing populism, I think, will define us. So we need to be very careful in the way that we engage in these debates. I'm saying we there, I'm including everyone. I'm a kind of general left within the room. Maybe you are not. So a last point here is just, if Brexit were to come alive, what might it look like? And I'll leave you with that.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and I would like to thank you very much, the organizer, Mr. Joan, Mr. Funk. I'm very happy to be here. I think I would, my first statement would be that, I cannot to talk about it in the time I have, but we can discuss it in the debate afterwards. I think that we are, the general statement would be that finance capitalism made possible to put a kind of implicit and covert ratios that always existed everywhere into a open and explicit ratios. It was not made, it was the ratios we live now is not new. It was only made possible for symbolic work that was done in the last decades. I think that that ratios come from a ontological cut between human and non-human. The most abstract and general ratios statement to me is made between spirit and body. That this is the most abstract. All other kind of ratios comes from and depends on this first ontological cut. It is gender, man is spirit, woman is body, superior classes also are spiritual classes, and the inferior classes are body classes for material and body work. And the culture, we never think about it, but the North, the cultures of the North are perceived as the culture of spirit, of the morality, of the intelligence, of the productivity, and all the cultures of the South, Latin America, Africa, most Asia, are the culture of the body. It means of the animal. Huh? You have the divine, which is spirit, and the body, the bodily, which is the animal kind. This is, to me, the most important, the most general, and the most abstract ratios. And it's not perceived, this is a thesis, no, it's not perceived from the science, from social science, everywhere. No? If you think a guy like Habermas, he would say, my theory applies to Western Europe and US, but he doesn't explain why this is not to be applied to Latin America, Africa, or Asia. For the critical thinkers, they don't get in the issue. But all other social science never discuss. This is a very important point. Brazil, to discuss the Brazilian case, we must discuss this, because what we have is a conception that capitalism is just flux of capital and exchange of merchandise. Capitalism is not that. And then when we think about the symbolical dimension, the cultural dimension, we think on national myth. There is capitalism is a material, economic issue, and then when we get to symbolic, it's always on a national level. National myth, of course. The Brazilian national myth is a kind of elaboration of this. Now, we have a slavocrat society. Man, there's only 7 minutes. I can't understand Gavin very well now. Let's go on. We have a slavocrat society. That was the greatest slavocrat society of all times. 5 million people was enslaved, and then just afterwards, in the political projects to whitening the nation, people get 5 million Europeans, and then it was made at 2 classes, society, not only based on race, but on classes, as we will see, and we have this a small elite, 1% at most, which reproduces the economic capital since then, and it was built a middle class that is at the maximum 20% of the Brazilian society, and that reproduces and monopolizes the reproduction of cultural capital, which is so important as money in capitalism. Right? Knowledge is so important as money. If you don't understand this, we don't understand capitalism. Right? What is really democratized in capitalism is never the economic capital everywhere, but the cultural capital. Right? A country like Germany and Sweden and so on, you have a generalized base for 80%, even 90%, right? where knowledge, where knowledge, knowledge even, is democratized for most part of society. In Brazil, you have this monopolized for the middle class. This is very important. No? And then you have not only not the presuppositions to acquire knowledge, which is very important, emotional and so on, and we never see this. And this is a basis of the class domination in Brazil, the reproduction of cultural and economic classes for this 20%. Brazil then made a scapegoat. The scapegoat is the state corruption. It is, this is a history which is told to everyone since 5 years old, that Brazil comes from Portugal. This is a lie. The cultural transmission is not made by blood. Portugal has never had a labor class society. Then we are the sons of slavery. Slavery is a totality institution who influences all the orders in all the other institutions. What we had in Brazil, for 3 or 4 minutes, what we had in Brazil is that every time a popular movement gets to power, and it happens 2 times, and it was an attempt of a 3rd one in the 60s. We have Getúlio Vargas in the 50s, and then Jango in the 60s, but then we have the American fleet in the Rio de Janeiro Bay to avoid it, and then you have now Lula and Dilma. Every time there is any effort to diminish this abyssal class division in Brazil, the middle class is used as a troop shot from this elite, with as a scapegoat having this selective political corruption of state and politics. You criminalize politics and state in order to stop any attempt of diminishing. This is, of course, a fascist. It reminds me very much in the writings of Erich Fromm in the 20s and in the 30s, where rational economic interests are coupled or covered from irrational ones, and then we have as the novelty from the last state coup in Brazil, not only the criminalization of the state and politics, but also the criminalization of equality. It was made from the criminalization of the Labour Party itself. It was said to the popular classes, and the press in Brazil is all bought by the financial capital, and it was said every time, every day, that the Labour Party is a criminal organization as such, not the totality of the party. When you said this, and this party was the representative of the poor people in land and city, what you are saying is that equality is no longer an end in itself, but just a means to an end, a means to the robbery in the state apparatus. When you say that to the poor people, where would go the resentment against the equality, which is the uniting affection from all those who are abandoned and humiliated? This comes up that if this is not any longer made as a political expression in a long-term project, it becomes resentment and violence as such, of course. And this is exactly what represents the fascist candidate Bolsonaro. And my time is over, and we can profound this all afterwards. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very honored to be here. So the topic of my presentation is Fromm's concept of necrophilia as a key to understanding Polish contemporary politics. At the beginning of this short presentation, we should clarify what or who shapes the contemporary Polish politics. Some of you know, since the autumn of 2015, the Polish government has been headed by the Law and Justice Party, supported by 39% of the voters, with the voter turnout at 51% in the 2015 parliamentary election. Since that time, we have had 2 prime ministers. These are not the prime ministers, members of the ruling party, Beata Szydło and Mateusz Morawiecki. However, it is common knowledge that they are not the decision makers in the organization. There is one leader to whom all the members of the Law and Justice Party look up. Sorry, yeah. The head of the party, Jarosław Kaczyński, is on the right. Your right-hand side. As this one person who almost single-handedly shapes the profile and policies of the government, it is interesting to look at his biographical information available in the public sphere. However, before we proceed to that, let us dwell for a moment on the name and the values transmitted by it of the party founded in 2001 by the twin brothers Lech and Jarosław Kaczyński, as it seems significant in the context of Fromm's necrophilia. In a 1964 essay, Creators and Destroyers, and In the Heart of Man, published the same year, Fromm characterizes necrophiles as cold, distant devotees of law and order. Kaczynski's party is called Law and Justice. What kind of justice? It seems justice according to the law, not, for example, social justice. In the same paragraph, Fromm explains the necrophiles dwell in the past, never in the future. Their feelings are essentially sentimental. That is, they nurse the memory of feelings which they had yesterday or believed they had. The values are precisely the reverse of the values we connect with normal life. Not life, but death excites and satisfies them. Now, it's impossible to talk about the Law and Justice Party and its second rise to power without an event that became a fundamental part of their political campaign in 2014-15, and their political discourse ever since, the 2010 Smolensk crash. On April the 10th, that year, 2010, a Tupolev aircraft of the Polish Air Force crashed while trying to land on an unprepared airport in Russia, killing all 96 people on board. Among the victims were the twin brother of Jarosław Kaczyński, the president of Poland, Lech Kaczyński, and his wife Maria, as well as many other statesmen and women representatives of the clergy or veteran organizations. They were headed to Katyn to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Katyn massacre of 1940, during which over 21,000 Polish citizens, mostly officers and intellectuals, were executed in a mass genocide. Although the investigation into the catastrophe has not finished yet, after 8 years of pursuing various hypotheses, the experts seem to agree that its cause was a series of coincidences, faults and errors on the Russian and Polish side, and circumstances independent of any human factor, like particularly bad weather. Still, a hidden and sometimes completely explicit message promoted by many politicians of the Law and Justice Party, with the brother of the deceased president included, was that the crash was the result of purposeful wrongdoing, even a bomb attack, either by the Russians or the Civic Platform Party, headed at that time by Donald Tusk, now the president of the European Council. An atmosphere of mystery and suspicion was created and enhanced, and the Law and Justice Party used the theme of the crash and the slogan, "We're going after the truth," to consolidate the support of a large group of the Polish population that responds well to claims of victimization and fear of outside threat. The unrelenting interest in the catastrophe and cult of the dead promoted by the Law and Justice Party has grown to such an extent nationwide that many public commentators began using a specific name for it, the Smolensk religion. Indeed, the Law and Justice established a whole set of religious and at the same time political rituals around the crash, tightening the link between concepts that in the Polish tradition, since the Enlightenment, have always appeared intertwined and up until now inseparable: truth, fatherland, suffering, Catholicism, reason of state, martyrdom. The most blatant example of what can be called the Smolensk religion are monthly celebrations organized by Jarosław Kaczyński and his followers commemorating the death of his brother and other victims, taking place on the 10th day of every month since the 10th of April 2010. There's been 98 such anniversary celebrations so far. The agenda is always the same. It starts with a Catholic Mass. Sorry about that, there was a short video from the Mass broadcasted on public TV, so there are broadcasts like this every month. Broadcast of the Mass. So the agenda is always the same. It starts with a Catholic Mass dedicated to the victims in an important church in the heart of Warsaw. Then the crowd carries out a so-called memory march down one of the most famous and central Warsaw streets and stops at the presidential palace where the deceased president used to live and where his brother addresses the crowd, talking habitually about getting near to the truth, fighting for the truth, approaching victory, punishing the traitors, and constructing monuments of the victims, especially Kaczynski's brother. These celebrations are attended by most members of the present government, given that, quote, attendance of the monthly anniversary is a sort of political declaration, end quote, as we hear from one of the politicians close to Kaczynski. However, not only do they take part in these public manifestations of Jarosław Kaczynski's care for the dead, but also in more private rituals of the leader. Before I proceed, I must mention two facts. All his life, Jarosław Kaczynski has lived with his mother. He has boasted in interviews about never having love relationships with anyone and has often stressed his intimate connection with the closest family, mother and brother, excluding the father. Roughly a year after Lech Kaczynski's tragic death, his mother also passes away, according to Jarosław, as a consequence of mediatic and political attacks against the family. With all of the closest members of his family gone, Jarosław Kaczynski dedicates a large share of his time to cultivating the memory. As Michał Szymowski, the author of a biography of Jarosław Kaczynski, found out, the leader of the Law and Justice Party visits the tombs of his relatives over 70 times per year, and his whole agenda is organized around these visits, taking place on specific days like the monthly anniversary of death, birthdays, name days, and other important dates. However, the seemingly private moment of communion with his dead is never private. As Paweł Kalisz, another Polish journalist, explains, quote, he never comes alone. He is always accompanied by a bodyguard and politicians and activists of law and justice. It's a whole ceremony. When the boss offers flowers at the tomb of his mother and the symbolic grave of his brother in the Proponski Cemetery in Warsaw, little skirmishes take place in the background. Everyone wants to be as close as possible to the boss, make himself seen, show their devotion. It's no secret to anyone in law and justice that those who are closer at the cemetery will soar quickly in politics. This relationship works both ways. When Antoni Macierewicz, a former Minister of Defense, lost his nomination in the government, headed right now by the present Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki, he also lost his right to take crucial positions in the crowd accompanying the boss during the Smolensk anniversaries. End of quote. One of the politicians of the ruling party confesses, it's another quote, everyone wants to be close to the boss. The same with handing in flowers or candles. It's a role all the members of the political club and the party aspire to. However, the most interesting thing happens later. The members of the delegation go back to the coach and to the city, and Jarosław with his bodyguards directs his steps to the grave of his father, situated in a different part of the cemetery. He goes alone, without his co-workers, as if only his mother and brother deserve the veneration of the party. May I mention here that the grave of Jarosław's brother, Lech Kaczynski, in Warsaw is a symbolic one because his and his wife's true remains were laid in a vault of the most important castle in Poland, Wawel in Krakow, alongside those of many kings, queens, princes and princesses. Also, it's interesting to note that the first sacrifice of the presidential couple, which was damaged during their exhumation in 2016, was transferred to the Instytut of Lech Kaczynski, a private mausoleum run by his brother next door to his very own house. The practices mentioned so far are only the top of an iceberg of what I perceive as the collective necrophilic orientation of the Law and Justice Party. For the sake of brevity, I am forced to leave out a 3-year-long national show of exhumations of the victims, accompanied by debates about parts of their fragmented bodies. The question of devastation of the natural environment or issues related to abortion, like paying women to give birth to children who, due to serious deformations, have no chance of surviving beyond the first couple of hours after the delivery and show signs of dying in agonizing pain. One important question remains to be answered. Why did Law and Justice win the elections and continue to cherish its strikingly high at about 35–40% popularity? My conviction, shared with many observers of the Polish political world, is that it was not due to economic or otherwise pragmatic factors. It was mainly due to ideological factors. I agree with Jacek Bartyzel, who in his 2016 article claims, law and justice placed its bet on ideas, and the competition in this realm was not sufficiently strong. These ideas include, among others, a conservative view of the customs based on the Catholic mythology, where personal freedoms of an individual have to be suppressed whenever the church requires it. Centrally directed economies assign the strength of the state controlling all aspects of a citizen's life, nationalist vision of Poland and the world divided into tribes, we others, and last but not least, the Smolensk religion since 2010. The Smolensk religion is all about martyrdom, mourning, and death. We can only understand how intrinsic these ideas are to the Polish collective identity when we first study Polish history and then Polish literature. According to Maria Joan, probably the most renowned Polish literary scholar, no other country in Europe based its identity to such an extent on literature as Poland. Not existing on the map for 123 years as a country and disappearing from it precisely when the modern states of Europe were taking shape or consolidating, Poland existed only in the symbolic sphere, hence the unusual importance of literary tradition in the shaping of our national identity. Poland ended when European Romanticism was beginning, and according to Jan in Poland, Romanticism lasted 200 years. And up until now, the two poems that each Polish child has to learn by heart in the process of his or her education are poems by a Romantic and a neo-Romantic writer, respectively. To conclude my presentation, I quote the latter, which I learned being 6 or 7 years old, and my son also did. Who are you? Oh, something's happening with the presentation. Yeah. Who are you, a young Pole? What's your sign? The White Eagle. Where do you live amongst my people? In what country? On Polish soil. What is that soil? My fatherland. How was it gained? Through blood and scars. Do you love it? I love her sincerely. And what do you believe in? I believe in Poland. What are you to her? A grateful child. What do you owe to her? The sacrifice of my life. You can wake me in the middle of the night and I will tell you this poem without any problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all presenters, and I would ask all of you to come to the podium now for a discussion of these points. And I apologize for all that I made you put them into 10 minutes, and thank you for doing it. My suggestion to have some time to collect already some questions from you, from the audience, and maybe collect 3 or 4 questions, which would be good. That might be general questions which the panelists could answer. Please, Charles.
Okay. I guess this is for all the panelists, but it's kind of provoked by Dr. Topolska's, brilliant presentation, and such a good case that this man is a necrophiliac character, and the figure of the deaf mother and his psyche is very much fits with malignant incestuousness. But the claim that it's not related to economic factors, I would question that, because it seems to me that, apart from the Brazilian case, which I think is more complicated, all of these cases that we're dealing with, the rise of the right in Poland, Brexit, and the rise of Trump in the US, it can't be a sheer coincidence that these things follow the 2008 financial crisis. I just do not believe that that is a coincidence. I think that is a fundamentally important historical moment, and I think that you know, thinking about Poland and thinking about Eastern Europe in general, you know, thinking about the rise of the far right in the Ukraine, for example, thinking about the appeal of Putin in Russia. You know, after the collapse of state socialism, the implementation of neoliberalism, I mean, in Frommian terms, what it provided was a certain kind of freedom, but it was negative freedom. You know, you're free from this domination by the state, but then where are you? You know, you're economically insecure. You feel like you're hanging in midair. And the appeal of nationalism then is to find some grounding, to find some roots, to find some stability. And, you know, so I think there's a connection between economic insecurity and these far-right movements.
Okay, maybe we take this as a starting point, because this was quite a full question addressing necrophilia, structures, crisis, and I think everybody might start and we can...
Okay, so maybe I'll answer first because you're referring to the communist state. So first thing to stress is that Poland was not affected by the economic crisis in Europe at all. Poland continued to have a growth, economic growth at around 3% or something. So it was a phenomenon, and it was a phenomenon that we owe to the civic platform actually, which was later it was like turned around, you know, and all the economic difficulties that we went through were blamed on the civic platform party, but that was basically not true. So that is one thing. Another thing is that the present government runs a very, very similar economic policy as the previous one. So actually, in economic terms, they don't differ a lot. One thing that appeared like a new thing for the poor classes is a subsidy for children at 120 euro per month for the second and every next child. But there are basically no other forms of support. And actually they cut some programs, some social programs that the civic platform introduced. So actually in terms of the economic view, they were very similar parties. They were kind of centric parties with some socialist proposals. But I think that what prevailed in the end was the question of ideology, because precisely that was the time, 2015, that was the time when the European Union tried to introduce the quotas for immigrants, and the civic platform wanted to accept some immigrants, and that caused an incredible uproar in the Polish society, because probably most of you know that we are very monocultural. I mean, there are almost no people of color in our society. So it's a huge shock. That was one thing. And the civic platform at that very same time, that was very like politically a bad movement, because they also wanted to introduce equality of gay marriages and so on. And it was basically, with the Catholic population of 90% in Poland, that was not acceptable to them. But I think I talk about the smallest religion because it is like going home for the Poles. You know, we all grow up with this strong idea of martyrdom. We read throughout our education, every year we read at least some, in every grade, at least some romantic poems. We learn them by heart. And these ideas of suffering for and being a martyr for the fatherland is so strong that people resonated with it like naturally, you know. It was like on the subconscious level. And actually until now, almost 30% of the population thinks that was a bomb attack by the Russians probably, because, you know, everybody always attacks us and hates us. And well,
I think maybe we could.
yeah, sorry, I'm sorry, yeah, I'm dominating the debate, sorry.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would love to know why you think Brazil is an exception.
I don't know if it is. So I don't know enough about the...
Yeah, but it was a very symptomatic, psychoanalytic thing you said. Because that's why I said that racism was always there. And that's why I said that financial capitalism could colonize that racial, which is worldwide, also in science. Also in science. I would love to dig a little bit into this, because to me it's the most important, the most abstract, and the most general question we should talk when we talk about racial. And I think, I think that the social struggle is the most important thing when we don't take it just economically, as Marx says. And if we get to the symbolic aspect, then we see that the class struggle is made according to the same rules everywhere, in whole capitalism. And in the Brazilian middle class, it's a very extreme case, because it is an abyssal inequality, but it's always to protect economic interests using some kind of symbolic device. In this case, this is the general thing everywhere, with no exemption. Because when you think that Brazil is an exception, we are accepting that it's another kind of human being, with another structure, with another kind of behavior, with a kind of animal behavior, because it's all it is all it's such as the emotions and sentimental and not spirit and all that. And then we are at the heart of racism, and are covering one. And the sadistic aspect of the middle class is also an aspect which is also generalized everywhere, in a way. Of course, the historical aspect of slavery points to a very extreme case, but it's a variation of something which is universal, and we really should dig into it more profoundly.
Thank you. If I understand your question correctly, in relation to the presentation I gave, for example, did you have a sense that I was arguing for much more than economic determinism, but was maybe...
No, I mean, but what I don't think you were arguing for economic determinism. I mean, I don't.
Because I wasn't. No.
And I'm not either. But
yeah.
I think that I mean, Brexit.
Yeah.
I think, in the background of it, there's austerity.
Yeah, exactly.
There's the general crisis of the EU. I mean, the events in Greece, I don't think are irrelevant to Brexit. So, so why the clinging to nationhood? Why now? Why now? That's what I'm saying. Yeah. And I think that the sense of insecurity, heightened sense of insecurity from the financial crisis, contributed to these sort of clinging to national symbols.
Yeah. That was what I was addressing. Yeah. We couldn't go into it as much detail, but yeah, there's clearly the rise of UKIP, for example, in the UK. The situation there was really exploited by them to become have a breakthrough moment, especially in European elections, particularly after the economic crisis and austerity. So Gunari's account of Greece also, and this social necrophilia, is very much linked with the impact of austerity and then the bailout conditions and how that was punitively imposed. I think so. So I was arguing for that. But the issue of ontological security that you mentioned, I think, seeking security in these perhaps traditional sources, such as masculinity for men in many Western nations who are in precarious jobs because of austerity and because of changes, very broad economic changes. I think that is really important. But what I was emphasizing with the issue of becoming as well is that's necessary to include the affective features of the impact of austerity, the uncertainty that creates, and then the possibility for that to be exploited. So, on most readings of populism, you have the description of the supply side and the demand side. Supply side being the types of discourses propagated by politicians and people like Nigel Farage, for example. So the appeal to fear and the use of fear, but also you have on the other side the supply side, and people really taking this opportunity of the EU referendum, I think, to punish politicians and elites for creating these conditions in which they were left behind. So I think that's an important part of the story, I think. But the kind of affective features are really crucial to explain. So what I didn't address was some of the different explanations for the appeal of right-wing populism through this idea of bypassed shame. I think that really has an important role to play in the explanation, and perhaps that will come out. But yeah, I've taken enough time.
Sorry.
No, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I was trying to emphasize that to some extent. Actually, I'm trying to avoid both economic reductionism and psychological reductionism, and I feel like those are the kind of two threads that are happening right now in the U.S. around fascism. And so the economic reductionism doesn't really allow us to think about the fact that, for example, the far right in Europe and the US are really adopting this kind of Gramscian model where they realize that people are alienated, that they have a need for community and identity, and so they're providing like direct aid to people, like Casa Pound in Italy is having a fascist cardiologist who will only treat you if you're a native Italian. And in Spokane, which I was just kind of using as a case study, Identity Europa, going around and giving out pork, of course, to homeless people of their choice. So they're thinking about dual power, they're thinking about direct aid, they're thinking about the kind of psychological and physical needs that people have and how they can meet those as the alternative to the left. So that's partially why I think we need to really be thinking about the psychological factors too. But absolutely, it all goes back to the financial crisis, it all goes back to capitalism producing crises cyclically, and that's what makes fascism kind of keep re-emerging as a possibility. In the US, after the financial crisis, around the time of the financial crisis, we had two populist movements. So we had the Tea Party, which was the right-wing populist movement, and we had Occupy Wall Street, which was the left-wing populist movement. Occupy Wall Street was crushed pretty aggressively by police action. And the Tea Party kind of fell apart as Occupy Wall Street was rising and had this better narrative and better ability to provide people with community and all of those things that people had been looking for on the far right. But if you think about the Tea Party, the symbol of the Tea Party was the snake on the yellow flag, right? It's called the Gadsden flag, and the slogan was, "Don't tread on me," which is just perfect negative freedom, right? So it's like, my liberty means I am left alone. That was the whole psyche of the Tea Party. And what we're seeing now is that the people who are becoming fascists, who are joining the alt-right in the US, a lot of them are former libertarians. So the negative freedom left them searching for a sense of purpose, identity, and community, because it by definition can't provide that, and now they're trying to find it on the far right.
Thank you very much to all of you for your presentations. And I have a quite general question, maybe a difficult question, but I was just wondering, I very much get the thread of necrophilia from Fromm, but using Fromm, one of the many reasons Fromm is of interest to me is the insistence on trying to go in a positive, productive direction. And it's a terrifying time in which to live, because at least, you're talking about the United States, but the sense of creeping similarities to the development of fascism and undermining of democracy is literally terrifying. So it raises the question of what does one do using Fromm at the moment at which this is actually occurring. So what do you have in the different national contexts you're referring to, a sense of how you can use Fromm in political terms to at least take some steps in the opposite direction? How is the left, for example, for Joan, to create the kind of community? How does one counter with more productive alternatives? I know that's a difficult question.
I'm very grateful for this question, because this helps also for me. I'm thinking we have 4 such experts as you to have a view like how can we make use of Fromm in contemporary accounts to understand nationalism as a global phenomenon.
So, well, of course, there are some actions you can take on an individual level, and then on a larger scale, on an individual level, I guess that all of us try to teach Fromm and explain nationalism through Fromm to our students in class. I guess all of us do that. And then, of course, there's some positive action. I mean, in Poland, women, like in many countries right now, women are the most important agents that face these nationalist threats and these policies of exclusion. So actually in Poland, women got involved in politics to an unprecedented extent at this moment. And also we have a party that is, well, it's a very new party. It's been around for 2 years now, and it's called Together. It's a leftist party, and right now, well, we don't know, we have elections in next year, parliamentary elections, and they are balancing on this threshold of 5%, and you need to have 5% to get into the parliament. In Poland, the situation is complicated with all the leftist movements because they are discredited because of the communist past. So everything that is connected, the name left in many heads makes, sets an alarm basically, because people like reflexively connected to the Soviet Union, to the communist past. So it's very difficult for the people from the left side of the political scene to get the message across. So yeah, right now, well, basically the parties that we had up until now, they're kind of centric, closer to right-wing. The party that is ruling right now is very right-wing ideologically. And there's actually no strong leftist party, but young people support very much this Together party, so this leftist. And there's some hope in the young, I think, because in the statistics, when you read, for example, even the question of their identification with Catholicism, actually in Poland, among all the countries that were measured recently in a report, I don't know by whom, but there was a report that appeared in many newspapers around the world. The gap between people who identified with, let's say, a state religion and people who don't, and in Poland, this gap between those who identify and who do not is the largest among all the countries researched. So right now, well, this is important because in Poland, as I showed in my slides, Catholicism is very, very much linked with the national identity and with nationalism. Well, I don't want to dominate the debate, so I'll pass on that.
Thank you. I'm not a Fromm specialist, but I think that as long as I remember from the things I read from Fromm, I think that the most important thing is the sadistic element. I mean, it's not only the social domination, it's not only an economic one. There is no economy at all as such. No? Economy is always pervaded by morality and the symbolic elements. And I think that this sadistic element is very important for social life. People from superior ranks or classes do not only buy more than the other ones. They want to exercise. This is a human contradiction. Want to exercise power on a daily basis, every time. And then this, I think that Fromm doesn't get to this point, but with other authors we could get to this, so that the above economy and above the psyche, we have this symbolic element of society, which the great philosopher Hegel is the guiding idea. Morality is over everything. If we see clearly. For instance, if you think things like the idea of a sensible man or woman, which is an empowering idea of the 18th century. The human being must be sensible, must go to arts and all this. This is an empowering moment, but at the same time, it's also is a try to differentiate those who are sensible from those who are not. Those who know what a good wine is, what a good work of art is, and those animals who drink cheap beer and doesn't know about art. At the same time, this sadistic element is within everything we feel.
I don't consider myself to be a Fromm expert, but what I take from Fromm is this emphasis on the biophilic features, the positive. So once you've identified the kind of necrophilic characteristics, I think from there, what you can do is you have an awareness, which then that awareness can hopefully lead into forms of practice, activism, resistance. But with the awareness also, you have the potential, as Fromm suggests, to move beyond these identifications or ontological certainty relying on group characteristics or traditional masculinity, for example, or nationality or religion, to move beyond that to a form of cosmopolitanism that is a vision of hope and solidarity. So I think it's this is one of the problems at the moment. We're still not really seeing, I think even in the UK, convincing narratives of kind of hope and solidarity. For example, there was really in the referendum debate, there was no defence of European membership of the EU as something that could be a force for good or was something that was preventing these conflicts and actually had led to peace and prosperity. So there was never anyone defending that. In fact, most of the kind of discourse was around the economic problems that would occur. There was nothing about the identity, the national identities, trying to encourage something more cosmopolitan. I mean, cosmopolitanism is not necessarily the answer, but that notion from Fromm of identifying solidarity with others, that of course we need for, in terms of asylum, of refugees and migration, that is really one of the messages to keep spreading and challenging, also resisting the politics of fear, as Ruth Wodak calls it, the politics of fear and the discourses of right-wing populists, because when you do that, you break up their ability to dictate the narrative. And they're dictating this story, and you have this necrophilic, in the UK, this necrophilic celebration of the breaking up of this, the UK's relationship with the European Union, and it's so deadening, and it's so frustrating, and I think there's that, and the fact that, even in the way that's reproduced in individual conversations, you find that there's no positive vision. you're either a traitor or you're against this. So those are some answers, I think. Yeah.
I think a lot about the concept of prophetic messianism in Fromm, and the distinction between prophetic and catastrophic messianism, or prophetic thinking and apocalyptic expectation. And I think that's super important because the alt-right, the fascists in the US right now, they're influenced by this worldview of coming apocalypse, right? And so they're trying to actually ramp up divisions and chaos so they can get this kind of cleansing conflict to tear down what exists. So Steve Bannon, for example, I've been giving a series of presentations to different community groups about his ideology. Steve Bannon was the chief advisor to Trump, the editor of Breitbart News, a very far-right news outlet. He's influenced by people like Julius Evola, René Guénon, the traditionalist school of reactionaries who believed that history moves in this kind of cycle. And according to Bannon and his crowd, were like due for this remaking of reality, right? And so the left needs to not do that, right? That's not going to help right now. But what we do need, it's an alternativism, right? So the term alternativism and Fromm, we're not determined, and we're also not just kind of in a free-for-all. We're in a really crucial moment where we need to make a decision between socialism and barbarism. And the center politically is gone. So the idea that somehow we're going to run under Hillary Clinton and get everyone out to vote and rah, 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 will be fine, is just, to me, completely impossible. I mean, it's possible that in 4 years we'll elect a Democrat, or that in this coming election we'll elect more Democrats to Congress, but we're just going to end up with a cycle of more fascists and street battles and civil war if we don't actually deal with the fact that the center is falling out. So we're going to have to move actively left. And I think one of the ways that we want to think about doing that is thinking about it as social and cultural, and not just as giving people the right answer. So I hang out with a lot of Marxists. I'm a Marxist, I'm a sort of loosey-goosey type, but I hang out with Trotskyists lately, and the Trotskyists are like, we just have to explain to people, it's all about the working class, it's all about the unions, we're going to rally the unions, and there really are no unions. There are some, and that's important. But what we need to do is think about, like, you know, how are we going to not just give people the right line, like here's the explanation for your situation, but how are we going to provide some place for people to go? So people who are alienated and atomized in society, there's a need for community, there's a need for, I think, co-ops, alternative businesses, alternative concerts. There needs to be a whole culture around providing a left alternative.
We have a couple of questions. We might want to collect them. Get something right?
I think first Reinhard, the comment assets of Braune, I think it would be good if Reinhard is first also.
Okay. I'm staying here. First, thank you very much for all your contributions. The wrong side. Now it's okay. Let me start with one sentence you said, that populism is an imagined will of the people. And that is exactly the question. Is it really only the imagined, or is it the real, the not so much conscious of, but if the populists speak out what people feel under the surface. And that is exactly the question. The problem of Trump is not the highly narcissistic person Trump, but the voters who voted for Trump and what is going on there. And the same holds true for the Kaczynskis and so on. So from this, a more social psychological point of view, I think is necessary, and I would continue the question of Lynn's answer, that a common point is this nationalistic attitude and striving there is going on. And in a Frommian sense, nationalism can have to do. Much is in a way connected with, in most forms, with an idealization of the own and a devaluation of the others. And if such a psychodynamic is going on, we have a narcissistic psychodynamic. That is a very typical narcissistic, social narcissistic psychodynamic, that one group is idealizing themselves and at the same time devaluated. That can be also, it has not to be such a narcissistic dynamic, it can also be an authoritarian sadistic, as it is in the fascist groups and so on. But there you have a way of idealizing oneself in the way that you are the one who has a saying and the others have to be obedient, and that there is a strong symbiotic connection between these two. Then we have an authoritarian nationalism. And of course, that was very interesting, the contribution of Ewelina Topolska from Poland, that there may be, it's really a necrophilic dynamic going on, besides this very authoritarian, which is still going on, I think, in the Eastern European countries like Hungary or Poland and or also Ukraine and so on. So what I want to say, one should include this aspect of social narcissism, because this social narcissism would explain a lot of what is going on. And the main question is, why do need so many people to idealize the own, if not that they have a deep feeling of being unimportant, worthless, have no self-esteem, and so on. And that is the main, from a psychological point of view, the main question. What is going on there? What has this to do with capitalism of today? What has this to do with our wonderful computers and social medias, where our own thinking, own feeling, own acting is not practiced anymore? And we are indeed the slaves of these wonderful machines. The impact of this for our self-esteem, for our feeling potent, one should reflect, and so on. I think this I'd like to add this narcissistic aspect if the question of nationalism is looked at. Thank you.
Maybe before taking another question, anyone wants to comment?
Thank you for the opportunity to clarify the issue of imagining. I wasn't saying that that these are imagined phenomena at all. Rather, I think I was meaning imagining in the sense of Anderson's sense of an imagined nation, an imagined group, and how that is appealed to in some of the discourses. So I'm surprised to hear myself thinking of this, saying it, but I'm kind of almost a critical realist these days in terms of emotion, in terms of affect, collective emotion and national kind of features. What I mean by that is it's not enough, I think, to just analyse the discourses of leaders, for example, evoking these different kind of nation that's enraged or has resentment or resentment, and that this is driving things. So there's complex work to be done analysing the discourses of the supply side of kind of populist leaders and politicians. And then responses to that on the left, and through a variety of mechanisms, which include actually intervening in social media, which is desperately needed. And then on the demand side, I think there's very much imagining is part of the process, but it's much more than that, and I think it's very real, these feelings of anger, of dissatisfaction, of disappointment, of betrayal. If I can give a brief plug, we actually have a special issue, a colleague and I, for Society, Humanity and Society, the journal. We have an issue on exactly this issue, backlash politics, the role of emotion and complex emotions, and how that is involved in this, not just at the individual level, and not necessarily only aggregate, but also genuinely collective. And I think that leads into the point of emotion generally, which I'll let others talk about.
It's okay. We wanted to collect some...
We have some questions.
Yeah. There is another question.
You can make a question now.
Yes, thank you very much for all of this. When I was thinking and trying to go back to Lynn's comment about what can come next, in a sense, a couple of thoughts from emotion theory that I used to study came to mind, and I was thinking about the difference in emotion theory between hatred, anger, and rage. Hatred being a complex emotion that has as its goal the elimination of the other. It's not just against, it's to eliminate. And I was thinking about the evoking of hatred by the right wing through kind of simple statements, make America great again, you know, simple soundbite statements that I think can evoke that what hatred does functionally, because emotion theory looks at the function of every emotion, no matter how negative, it makes for cohesion. When you hate, you are in a cohesive state, as opposed to, for instance, in an anxious state, which is the opposite. And so my question is, how can we make for cohesion on the other side?
I would like to bring in that Fromm has a big study on racism, which he made shortly before the Second World War with the working class, and where he has one of his, what he found out was that in Germany there was an interesting thing, that just a few people only by deepest conviction were left, and a few people only by deepest conviction were right, but the most of the people were like ambivalent, and you could use them even from that side or from right side to be on your side to get to such undemocratic or democratic ways of living. And then he had a big study in Mexico where he had referred to a Brazilian pedagogian called Freire, who has concepts of how you can bring enlightenment to working class people. So that was just what I wanted to bring in, because he has a lot of ideas how to go on with it, or to handle it.
I think I can join this statement and also what Ryan Funk said. We heard a lot about cultural factors, ideological policies, and so on. I think that's extremely universal and we need it for integration, for a complex theory. But nevertheless, in this old study you just mentioned about authority and family by Erich Fromm and his fellows, also critical theory in the Weimar Republic. I think one factor was the authoritarian education that led, for example, to deficits or a non-development, for example, in empathy, in pro-social orientations. If I bring this together with the great tradition of moral education psychology by Lawrence Kohlberg, James Restor in Switzerland, Fritz also, then I ask, or I think, it is not by accident only why a concrete individual joins a fascist or right-wing populist movement. It should also have to do with the primary socialization in the family, and of course, and I think you, Ewelina Topolska, told us about it, the secondary socialization. And for me, it's also a big question how to counter this socialization climates in the family and in the primary schools. I think there are causes for concrete fascism of the adolescence.
I suggest we take 3 questions and go to another one afterwards, otherwise it's too difficult to remember. So we have motion, cohesion, ambivalence.
I think I'm not going to respond to everything, but I think the question of narcissism is very important here. And if you look at the, I think it's interesting to study memes that the far right is using in the US. Like, for example, the young man at the high school. And I've been involved in actually a lot of activism around this, like, constantly for the past few months, trying to figure out, how can we shut down fascist recruitment in high schools and all of this stuff happening in my city. And that young man, his pictures online, he's got one where he is posing in front of an enormous truck, holding an enormous rifle, dressed in camo, and it says beneath it, Jerusalem belongs to Christians, Deus Vult. And if you look up Deus Vult online and you look at the Deus Vult memes, I don't know if you have done this, but it's all about this sort of heroic knight figure. It's like the young man who is, and it often will have cartoons, comics of a young man in a classroom alone, or being laughed at, not with the popular kids, and then it will show him dressed as a crusader, crusading for the far right. So there's definitely a lot of that going on. And if you look at YouTube videos, also you've got these people who are totally banal. Like, it's hard to listen to them because they have no sense of self, and they just drone on for hours, but they have tons and tons of followers. And these are people who just love to look at themselves online spewing this hate. So it's a huge phenomenon for sure, and it's not just Trump, it's a social problem. I also appreciate the question about Paulo Freire, and I think popular education is super important right now, and it's important to realize, even just like with Brexit, not all Trump voters fall into this stereotype, right? It's really scary right now. There are these far-right organizations. But just to give you a quick example, so I have a friend in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is a labor state, historically Democratic Party, but went for Trump. And she comes from one of the many immigrant community traditions there. Her grandparents were Polish immigrants. And pro-union, no, not socially conservative, not economically conservative, basically progressive on any issue you could name, working class girl. And she voted for Trump because of 2 things. Number 1, she thought Hillary would take us into war. And number 2, he promised to rebuild industry. And so she had this hope that somehow a nationalist economic model could save us. So there is that, and that also gives me some hope that some of this is salvageable if we can still talk to those people and not just isolate them further. But within the actual far-right movements, it's a very there is this kind of pathological narcissism that's really interesting to look at.
And in terms of, I think this, before looking at the issue of narcissism, it's interesting to refer to Ali Hochschild's work recently on Trump and voters in the UK, voters for Trump in America, and that analysis where she talks initially, at least, about an empathy divide and the difficulty of talking across this divide. And I think that's something that is very difficult to do, but I've done it also myself for some qualitative research where I interviewed 20 UKIP voters at 3 different points in longitudinal qualitative work. And And you get a sense of that, of this really complex dynamic between the disappointment, the betrayal, perhaps even the shame, underlying this anger, this feeling of failure, and I'm kind of to blame for it in an individualized neoliberal way. But finding that that's balanced with this appeal to pride, and some attempts even, which have been analysed, of Trump's rallies, where he did evoke some genuine feeling in a kind of Durkheimian way, an effervescence that converted into a pride that was actually palpable. It wasn't just rhetoric. So there's very interesting emotion management processes there to create these feelings. But again, with the danger of being self-promoting, I mean, there's a book that I wrote with many excellent contributors on collective pride, which Thomas contributed to as well. And that's a little old now, it's 4 years or so, but we were looking at these issues of kind of where collective pride can become collective hubris or collective arrogance. And it's easy to have a slide from one into the other, and it's better, I think, to focus on the affective dynamics rather than, so why particularly? I think because they're in flux, they're changing. So it's important to see how this happens, how you can get for something that's joyful and celebratory like a World Cup, but then find that actually that's mobilized for other more negative purposes to kind of then be used to say, well, we are special or world leading, and to have the denigration of others. So I can't talk any more about that, but yeah.
Just to show my ambivalent German side of time management, once again, we have only 5 minutes left, so I think that's why I have to...
Yeah, sure. I just to say a word on this cohesion and narcissism. I think they are very unite, and I think then is the Brazilian case is a reversal in a way, and I think this point could be interesting. I mean, of course, people who are being under this collective action are the losers of the finance capitalism. No? They are mobilized. This is the missing word. The people who are mobilized are the losers of finance capitalism that they cannot understand, of course. And since they cannot understand, they can be used and manipulated, and it is probably not very different from the discourse of Imperial England. For instance, the speeches of Gladstone to the British working class, and we are the mighty, we are the best, and all those. And though you are poor, you are belonging to through imagination, to something very strong, and but then Brazil is the reversal case, and then there's something very interesting, because then we have an economic dependency worldwide in a way, and then for Latin America, this phase of finance capitalism was an empowering one. For the first time since centuries, the poor people in Latin America was gaining more money, and the economy was beginning to be used for the majority of people. The oil, the water, the natural resources, and all this, and through industrialization of infrastructure. And then it was cut. It was cut. It was, and then, of course, there is an engineering. It's not arbitrary. It has a center. Somewhere it is a center. Someone or a group is working on this, because when you the whole corruption issue in Brazil, and of course in all Latin America, was made by the security department in the US. And it was incredible, but with prosecutors, federal prosecutors in Brazil, and it was not under any kind of legal limitation. It was a private. Those people for years exchanged information, and then the federal prosecutors in the US, of course, they are all schooled in a geopolitical, very smart politics, and the Brazilians aren't, in a way. And then it was a very easy job that Brazil gave very easily Petrobras and all the cutting edge enterprises that was still there, and it's and everything is being sold, and there's nothing to empower. And the symbolic message was not directed to the losers of finance capitalists, but from the middle class. The middle class was mobilized against the poor, against the elite, unorganized popular classes. That would be a very interesting difference from the global south perhaps and the global north.
Okay, so I'll just briefly touch upon the issue of the group narcissism, because of course it's a very important factor in Poland. We are a nation with a very strong inferiority complex. In the 18th century we were a huge commonwealth, Poland and Lithuania. Then due to internal weaknesses and struggles between dukes and so on, we were partitioned 3 times. Poland disappeared from the map for 123 years. Then we had a couple of years of independence. Then after the Second World War, we fell under the rule of Russia. So there is this strong need for kind of glorifying our national identity, and actually during this whole period of Romanticism, all the poets were repeating that we were the Christ of nations, we were the martyr of Europe, and in that way glorifying our identity. So of course there's this component. And as for the education stuff, unfortunately the ruling party, Law and Justice right now, they are introducing even more authoritarian measures into the education, so it's going to be even worse. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Now I have to show the other part of my ambivalent German. So I don't know exactly when we should end the discussion. 11:50? Okay, so...
There's a break until 11:30.
Okay, so then I would really thank all of you for your great... Thank you all. I'm very sorry that I couldn't take all questions, but I'm in the coffee break. I'm sure that you're around and we can continue to discuss it.